They say blood remembers, that the sins of ancestors do not fade with time, but wait, patient as shadows, for descendants to inherit their weight. Jonathan Caldwell had spent most of his life outrunning that truth. But blood, as he would learn, is not so easily escaped. The letter had come on a rain-heavy morning. His uncle, the last Caldwell before him, was dead. No wife, no children. No one but Jonathan remained to carry the name, or to inherit what the family had left behind, a sprawling manor on the edge of Blackwood Moor, untouched by the living for decades. The solicitor's words had been dry and without sentiment, but Jonathan had read them again and again, as though each line were a judgment. For years Jonathan had struggled in the city. Debts, failed ventures, a reputation that slipped further each season. He carried himself with the weariness of a man who had once believed in success, but whose faith had thinned like paper in rain. The manor, he thought, might be his chance to begin again. Not a palace, perhaps, but a refuge, a place to rebuild what he had lost. The road to Blackwood stretched long and narrow, bordered by windswept heath, where no birds sang. Villages lay scattered at its edges, and in each one the name Caldwell fell like a stone into silence. The innkeeper who poured Jonathan's ale avoided his eyes. The old women who hushed their grandchildren as he passed gave no greeting. A name, Jonathan thought, should be a key. His was only a warning. At last, the manor appeared. Blackwood stood against the horizon like a sentinel, its windows pale and blank as watching eyes. Ivy clung to its stones like veins blackened by rot, and its chimneys bled no smoke. To Jonathan, it looked less like a home than a mausoleum, but one that still waited for its last inhabitant. He crossed the threshold at dusk. The door opened with reluctant groan, and the air inside was cold, scented of damp wood and moth-eaten fabric. Dust lay across the floor in layers thick enough to remember every step taken. The portraits that lined the corridor, his ancestors grim and unblinking, seemed to lean closer with his passing. Men in stiff collars, women with veiled faces, children who smiled without warmth. Their silence was not absence, but accusation. Jonathan found his uncle's study just as the sun bled out behind the moors. Papers lay scattered across the desk, journals stacked in uneven piles, their spines cracked and pages warped. He took one in hand, opening to the middle, and read by lantern glow. The entries were fragmented, but each bore the weight of a fraying mind. They whisper at night, always from the walls, not rats, not boards, voices. Mirrors no longer hold reflection alone. A second face lingers when mine has gone. The house does not sleep. I am watched. Jonathan set the book down with a tired exhale. His uncle, he reasoned, had been alone too long. Isolation curdled men's minds, and Blackwood, with its endless corridors and darkened windows, would do worse than solitude. Still, a cold unease lingered in his chest. That first night he made his bed in a guest chamber, ignoring the master bedroom where his uncle had surely slept last. The walls seemed to breathe, wood settling with long, groaning sighs. He told himself it was nothing more than the age of the place, yet when the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, light, deliberate, and unaccompanied, he froze. He called out, voice trembling with his own disbelief, but no answer came. When he opened the door, the corridor lay empty, its dust undisturbed. Hours later, as he drifted between waking and sleep, Jonathan heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a low hum. At first it seemed the moor's wind pressing through the cracks, yet as he listened, he realized it was not the voice of weather at all. It was layered. A chorus, faint but human, each tone threaded with grief. He rose from his bed, pressing his ear to the wall, and felt the vibration beneath his skin. The house itself seemed to speak, as though its stones had mouths, its timbers lungs. By dawn, Jonathan was no closer to rest. He told himself the manner could be mended, that dust could be swept and silence tamed, yet he could not shake the sense of being observed. Portraits watched, mirrors lingered, and every creak of the floor spoke of presence. Blackwood was not merely walls and hearth, it was a vessel of memory, one that waited for him, as though its long sleep had ended with his return. Jonathan Caldwell was weary, but for the first time he wondered if the weariness was his alone. Perhaps it was something carried in the blood, grief inherited, guilt passed down, waiting for its final heir. And so I ask you, if a house breathes with the sins of a family, does a man step into it as its master or as its prisoner? The second day at Blackwood Manor dawned grey, the mist clinging low across the moors as if reluctant to release the house from its grasp. Jonathan wandered its halls with lantern in hand, tracing the architecture with uneasy reverence. The place was vast enough to lose oneself in corridors stretching without end, staircases curling upward like ribs into shadow. It was during these aimless wanderings that he found the gallery. The door opened into a long chamber, whose windows were sealed by heavy drapes, leaving the air stale with dust and varnish. Along its walls hung the faces of generations, the Caldwell line rendered in oil and pigment, preserved in silence. Each portrait was large, framed in gilded wood now dulled with age, yet the faces within seemed immune to dust or time. They gazed outward as though the act of being painted had captured not merely likeness, but soul. Jonathan's steps slowed. The air here felt heavier, as though charged with unseen weight. One by one, his eyes passed over the solemn figures, men in military coats, judges in their robes, women with pearls around pale throats, children clutching dolls with stiff, unyielding smiles. None smiled warmly. None carried the ease of life. There was only stillness, their gazes sharp, almost predatory. And then Jonathan saw him. The portrait hung larger than the rest, positioned at the gallery's far end where light, if any dared enter, would fall upon it first. Elias Caldwell, the patriarch, the founder of the estate and fortune in the late 1700s. Elias was painted not as a man, but as a monument, his shoulders draped in black velvet, his hand resting upon a cane of silver. His face, long and severe, bore eyes sharp as flint, eyes that seemed alive. Even now, even here, Jonathan felt them follow him, each step through the chamber, drawing that gaze like an invisible tether. The expression was not hostile. No, it was worse. Elias Caldwell looked upon him with ownership, as though Jonathan were not heir, but inheritance. Jonathan drew nearer. What unnerved him most was not the size of the painting, nor its prominence, but its preservation. The other portraits bore the passage of years, pigments faded, oils cracked, varnish yellowed with time, but Elias remained untouched. His colors burned deep and fresh, his oils unbroken, as though the brushstroke had dried only yesterday. Jonathan touched the frame, half expecting the paint still to be wet beneath his hand. Later, in the study, Jonathan turned to his uncle's journals. He found page upon page devoted to Elias, scrawled with obsessive fervor. His uncle called him the first sinner, the one who bound us all. Beneath these words lay fragments of prayers and curses alike, scribbled until ink bled through the page. What sin had Elias committed that so consumed his descendants? The journals did not say plainly, but hinted at bargains, at oaths sealed, not with law or scripture, but with blood. That night, Jonathan dreamed. He stood once more in the gallery, but the room pulsed with warmth, its walls breathing like the ribs of some slumbering beast. The portraits stirred, their painted eyes blinked open, one by one gazes turning upon him with dreadful hunger. But Elias stepped down from his frame, his black velvet brushing the floor with soundless weight. His face was not frozen in paint now, but alive, his smile cold, measured, and deliberate. "Blood remembers," Elias whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You are mine." As they were mine, The land, the house, the fortune, it endures because I bound it so. You need not struggle as your father did, nor waste yourself as your uncle did. All this is yours, if you accept the burden, power, wealth, legacy, all in exchange for what was promised. Jonathan awoke in sweat, heart pounding. His chamber was dark save for the pale intrusion of moonlight. The whisper still echoed in his ears. He told himself it was only a dream, a trick of mind fueled by the journals, the portraits, the weight of his new inheritance. Yet he could not shake the certainty that Elias Caldwell had spoken to him, not in dream alone, but through the blood they shared. In the morning, Jonathan returned to the gallery, drawn by dread as much as curiosity. The air was colder now, the silence heavier. He found himself before Elias's portrait once more. Something was different. Where before the mouth had been set in grim severity, now its corners bent ever so slightly, curved upward in the faintest trace of a smirk. Jonathan's breath caught. He blinked, stepped back, told himself it was a trick of light, yet the smirk lingered. The eyes glimmered with something near amusement, as though Elias Caldwell himself mocked his denial. Jonathan's hands trembled as he closed the drapes over the frame, shutting out that gaze. Yet even with the portrait hidden, he felt its presence pressing through cloth and wood, watching still. For the first time, Jonathan wondered if the Caldwell curse was not misfortune, not some nameless shadow passed through generations, but a pact, a deliberate act, chosen and sealed by Elias himself, binding every descendant that followed. If that were true, then the curse was not a prison imposed from without. It was an inheritance, waiting for acceptance. And Jonathan, alone within the rotting chambers of Blackwood, feared that Elias Caldwell was not waiting for him to resist, but for him to surrender. The longer Jonathan stayed within Blackwood Manor, the more he felt its walls pressing inward, as though the house itself resented silence and demanded remembrance. Each night, the whispers grew louder, threaded voices humming through plaster and timber, and each morning, Jonathan's unease deepened. It was during one of these restless days that he turned his steps toward the West Wing, a place his uncle's journals had mentioned only once, and always with unease: the servants' quarters. The corridor that led there was long sealed by a warped oak door, its hinges rusted, its threshold heavy with dust, as though no one had passed through in decades. Jonathan forced it open with a groan that echoed like a wound torn wide. The air that greeted him was different, thick, stagnant, laden with mildew and the faint trace of rot. It smelled not merely of abandonment, but of memory left too long to decay. The quarters themselves were narrow and plain, rows of small rooms with low ceilings, their cots stripped bare, their wardrobes empty, yet the walls were not bare. Words had been scratched into the plaster with knives, nails, or desperate fingers, some shallow, some deep enough to break stone. Jonathan raised his lantern, its light catching on gouged phrases that repeated, overlapping as if scrawled by many hands through many nights. The master watches. Do not answer him. The cellar is his chapel. Jonathan's hand trembled as he traced the letters. Whoever had lived and worked here had been more than servants. They had been witnesses, prisoners, victims of something they could not flee. In one room, the floorboards sagged. Kneeling, Jonathan found a hidden compartment beneath the wood. Within lay a bundle of letters, yellowed with age and tied with fraying ribbon. Their ink had browned, their paper fragile, but the words endured. They were written by a maid, unnamed but desperate, addressed to no one. Perhaps they had been meant for the outside world, or perhaps they were confessions never sent. Jonathan read them by lantern light, each line tightening the noose of dread around his heart. The maid wrote of feasts held in Blackwood, grand gatherings where Elias Caldwell entertained nobles, merchants, and clergy alike. The tables overflowed with wine and meat, the chandeliers burned until dawn, and laughter shook the rafters. But beneath that glamour, darkness lived. Livestock were found drained of blood, their carcasses left in the fields without wound or struggle. Children from nearby villages vanished, their names whispered only in mourning, never in accusation, for no one dared accuse a Caldwell. The maid had seen guests wander the cellars after midnight, their eyes glassy, their hands trembling as though caught in rapture. She had heard chants muffled beneath the earth, voices raised not in prayer to God, but to something unnamed, older, hungrier. One line in particular chilled Jonathan to his marrow. Elias is wed to something older than God. It feeds on what he offers, and in return his coffers grow, his name endures, his house prospers. We are not servants here. We are sacrifices waiting our turn. Jonathan let the paper fall into his lap, his breath shallow, his heart pounding, as though the words themselves carried the weight of ritual. His uncle's ravings were no invention. They were echoes of truth. The fortune that had built Blackwood was not carved from toil or trade, but from blood. The realization hollowed him. He thought of the townsfolk, their silence, their avoidance. He understood now. They did not speak of the Caldwells, because the name itself was poison, a line that had fed upon their own. Jonathan sat in the dim light of that forsaken room, the letters spread before him like a litany of accusation. For the first time he questioned not merely the curse but his place within it. Could inheritance itself be poisoned? Could blood be so bound to sin that no descendant escaped its stain? As he pondered, the lantern guttered, its flame shrinking though no wind stirred. Shadows gathered thick at the corners of the room, lengthening with unnatural intent. The carved words on the wall seemed to writhe, their grooves darkening as if freshly cut. And then came the sound. From beneath the floorboards, faint but undeniable, a rhythm, the shuffle of feet, a murmur of many voices. The cadence of prayers never meant for heaven. Jonathan pressed his ear to the ground, his skin prickling with cold sweat. What he heard was not memory, not echo. It was present, alive. He stumbled back, clutching the letters to his chest, as though they were talismans. But the words offered no comfort. The whispers followed him out of the servants' quarters, echoing up the stairwell, clinging to his steps. That night, Jonathan lay awake in his chamber, staring into the dark. He thought of the maid who had written those desperate lines. Had she escaped? Had she been consumed by the rituals she described? The silence of her letters was answer enough. And still, the voices in the walls hummed their endless lament. They no longer sounded like strangers. They sounded like kin. Jonathan Caldwell realized with sickening certainty that he was not merely inheritor of Blackwood's wealth, nor its stones, nor its silence. He was heir to its covenant. And the covenant was hungry. Jonathan had begun to notice a pattern in his uncle's journals. They circled endlessly around Elias Caldwell, but always stopped short of confession. The entries spoke of debts, of accounts yet to be settled, yet nowhere did they name what was owed, or to whom. It was as if his uncle had written in half-truths, protecting a secret even as madness gnawed at him. It was in the upper study, hidden behind a row of forgotten hymnals, that Jonathan found the object that answered those silences. A ledger. It was bound in leather, cracked with age yet stubbornly intact, its clasp secured not with lock but with twine. The book carried a smell unlike the other volumes, not the musk of mildew, but a sour tang like copper touched by flame. Jonathan cut the twine and opened it. At first glance, it resembled any account book, neat columns, ruled margins, dates written in steady hand. But there were no sums of coin, no mention of merchants, no signatures of trade. Instead, there were names, all Caldwell's, each written with precision, followed by annotations scrawled in a colder ink. Collected, promised, forfeit. Jonathan's eyes widened as he turned page after page. Each generation was listed, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. Yet not all were marked. Some names stood bare, while others bore those chilling words beside them, final as a gravestone. One entry from 1791, Thomas Caldwell collected. Another, from 1836, Margaret Caldwell, forfeit. Then, from 1862, Edward Caldwell, promised, fulfilled. The pattern emerged slowly, like rot creeping beneath floorboards. One Caldwell per generation was given, not to death by misfortune, but to sacrifice. Not chance, but covenant. A blood tithe. Jonathan's hands trembled as he reached the most recent pages. His uncle's name was there, Robert Caldwell, promised. But the annotation stopped. No collected, no fulfilled. Instead, beneath his name in ink, darker and fresher than the rest, was written simply, Jonathan Caldwell, next. His throat tightened. The air of the study grew dense, pressing against his lungs. All at once the silence of the villagers, the whispers in the walls, the smirk in Elias's portrait. It all aligned into a single, unbearable truth. The Caldwell wealth was not fortune, not luck, not skill. It was fed by sacrifice, purchased with the lives of kin, one by one, generation after generation. Blood traded for legacy, flesh for stone. And now, with his uncle childless and dead, the burden had shifted to him. Jonathan staggered back. The ledger clutched to his chest as though the act might keep its words from seeping into his skin. A fury welled within him, raw and burning. He had spent years failing in the city, watching dreams collapse, only to inherit a house steeped in the bones of his own blood. He would not bend to it. He would not yield his life to some ancient debt. That night, in defiance, Jonathan tore one of the ledger's pages free. It bore the name of a Caldwell long dead, marked collected. He fed it to the fire in the grate, watching the parchment curl, blacken and turn to ash. But the fire did not consume it cleanly. The flames sputtered, guttering as if choked by unseen breath. Smoke curled upward, not grey but a deep, unnatural black. Jonathan leaned closer, his anger faltering into dread. From within the hiss of the dying flame came a whisper, "It will be you." The voice was not his uncle's. It was not Elias's. It was not any human voice. It was cold, serpentine, threaded with hunger, older than language. It seemed to come from the very air, curling against his ear, seeping into his marrow. Jonathan stumbled back, his defiance wavering beneath the weight of terror. The page, though half-burned, remained. Its edges glowed faintly, resisting the final collapse into ash. He seized it, cast it into the hearth once more, but the flames recoiled. It did not burn. It endured, blackened but intact, as though bound by law no fire could break. He dropped it, heart hammering, sweat chilling his skin. For the first time, Jonathan felt not merely haunted, but claimed. The ledger lay open on the desk, its columns stretching back across centuries, its annotations carved into fate. Each name, each sacrifice had been accepted. The bargain was unbroken. Jonathan closed the book with a violent snap and shoved it beneath a pile of papers. His fury had not died, but it had been poisoned by fear. He whispered aloud, as though to assure himself, "I am not theirs. My blood does not bind me." But even as the words left him, the whisper coiled again in memory, soft and inevitable. "It will be you." And Jonathan Caldwell knew, denial did not unmake debt. Sleep does not come easily within Blackwood Manor. When it does, it arrives not as rest but as visitation. That night, Jonathan drifted into dreams that felt more like descents, down corridors that twisted and bled into themselves. He found himself seated at the head of the manor's grand dining table, though it was no table he remembered. The hall stretched impossibly wide, its ceilings vaulted with shadows, its chandeliers dripping with wax that hissed as it struck the tablecloth. Platters lay before him, golden dishes heaped high with roasted meats, fruits swollen with ripeness, and breads warm with steam. It was a feast of kings, extravagant beyond reason. And yet, with each blink, the illusion cracked. A slice of meat would glisten red, then pulse as though still alive. Grapes would shrivel black between his fingers. Bread would crumble into ash upon his tongue. The feast rotted before him, collapsing into decay, as though time were being hurried forward. The sweet fragrance of fruit soured to a stench of carrion. Across from him sat Caldwell, the painted patriarch, the one whose portrait refused to wither. His eyes gleamed with that same predatory hunger Jonathan had seen immortalized in oils, but here they were alive, bright, piercing, and impossibly amused. Around him gathered the shades of other Caldwells, women in gowns darkened by time, men in coats of velvet and lace now stained with damp. Their faces were waxen, their lips dripping with black ichor that slid down their chins like spilled wine. They raised their glasses high, voices blending into a chorus both mocking and reverent. To Jonathan, Elias declared, his voice like iron scraping stone, the final offering. They drank. Jonathan tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, weighted by chains unseen. He opened his mouth to speak, to refuse, but no words came. The air itself thickened in his lungs. He felt himself being consumed, not by hunger, but by expectation. A role had been written, and he was merely reciting the script passed down in blood. He awoke with a cry, drenched in sweat, the taste of rot clinging to his tongue. The candles in his chamber had burned low, their flames shivering though no breeze stirred. For long moments he sat upright, clutching the sheets, his breath ragged. Dreams, he told himself, only dreams. But dreams in this house had a way of leaving fingerprints. Drawn by unease, Jonathan left his room and wandered toward the grand hall. Moonlight filtered through high windows, pooling silver across the table where so many had once gathered. Dust lay thick upon the wood, yet when he brushed his hand across its surface, it came away clean, as though the table had been used recently. Something in him resisted leaving. His dream had guided him here, and part of him dreaded discovering why. He traced the edges of the table, the grain of the floorboards, until his foot struck a hollow note. Kneeling, he pressed his palm against the planks. They gave slightly, revealing the outline of panels cut with deliberate precision. His heart thudded as he pried one loose. The wood groaned and a smell exhaled from beneath, dry, acrid, tinged with the musk of ancient things buried and forgotten. He lowered a candle into the opening, and its flame illuminated a narrow stair descending into darkness. Every instinct urged him to close it and turn away, yet curiosity, no, obligation pulled stronger. He descended, each step echoing like a tolling bell. The chamber below was no cellar. It was a crypt, but not consecrated. Rows upon rows of bones lined the walls, stacked with a precision both reverent and grotesque. Skulls grinned from shelves, femurs were piled like cordwood, ribs arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. This was no burial ground. This was an archive. Jonathan staggered, the candle trembling in his grasp. He recognized the organization, the methodical cataloging of lives extinguished. These were not graves. These were trophies. At the chamber's center stood a long stone table, its surface scarred with grooves darkened by centuries of stains. He did not need to imagine what purpose it served. The feast in his dream had not been metaphor. It had been memory. His mind reeled. The letters in the servants' quarters had spoken of rituals, of livestock drained, of children vanished. Here lay the evidence. Not rumor, not fear, but fact. The prosperity of the Caldwell name had been built not on skill or fortune, but on slaughter, sanctified by pact. Jonathan sank against the wall, pressing his palms to his temples. Rage fought with horror, denial with inevitability. He wanted to scream, to deny that this was his inheritance, yet the bones whispered otherwise. He thought of Elias's smirk, of the ledger's damning words, of the voices that had hummed in the manor's halls since the night he arrived. It was all one song, one design. The house itself was an altar. Every feast, every celebration, every glass raised in toast had been an offering. And Jonathan, by stepping foot here, by claiming his uncle's estate, had already begun playing his part. The candle sputtered, its light shrinking as though suffocated by unseen hands. Jonathan forced himself back up the stairs, slamming the panel shut behind him. He stood in the grand hall, trembling, the silence pressing against his ears. Blackwood Manor was not haunted merely by memory. It lived, breathed, hungered, and it had marked him. It began with the mirrors. Jonathan would pass them in the dim corridors, their glass dulled by dust and time, only to feel something quicken within their depths. At first it was subtle, a flicker, a distortion, a shimmer like water disturbed by unseen hands. But soon the distortions grew bolder. His reflection rippled as though it were not glass but a pond, disturbed by a stone cast from within. And there, framed in the wavering surface, stood not Jonathan at all. Elias stared back at him. The patriarch's face was gaunt, sharpened by shadow, lips curled in the faintest suggestion of triumph. His eyes gleamed like oil catching fire, alive with malice and promise alike. Jonathan recoiled, shattering one mirror with his fist, but the next he passed betrayed the same vision. No matter how many he turned away from, Elias was there, patient, watching. The portraits, too, betrayed their silence. As Jonathan walked through the gallery, their painted lips seemed to stir. At first a hiss, too faint to be certain. Then words curling low and serpentine, return, fulfill, belong. The oil and canvas quivered as if straining against the frames, each ancestor whispering not in grief, but in summons. Jonathan would quicken his pace, yet the voices pursued, trailing him like gnats around a corpse. Even the town was no refuge. He descended one morning to fetch supplies, his steps carrying him through Blackwood's narrow streets, only to feel the air bend around him. Doors closed quietly as he passed, curtains twitched shut, conversations broke like fragile glass. The butcher, who had once spoken to him politely enough, muttered a prayer beneath his breath, refusing to meet Jonathan's eyes. Mothers ushered children indoors, and the church bell rang though no service was called. Jonathan left the market square with his sack half empty, his chest heavier than the weight it bore. Isolation clung to him like damp cloth. The town had seen something in him, or perhaps upon him, and their silence spoke of knowledge he had yet to claim. That evening, as the wind scoured the moors and rattled the window panes, Jonathan lit a lantern and pored over his uncle's journals again. The words shifted beneath his gaze now, taking on new gravity. Phrases once dismissed as ravings. The house breathes, the pact still binds, the soil beneath hungers, no longer felt like metaphor. They felt like testimony. But one entry caught his attention. A name written again and again with trembling hand. Margaret, followed by a note. She remembers. She alone. Jonathan sought her the next morning. She lived not in Blackwood proper, but in a cottage at the edge of the woods, its roof sagging, its garden overrun by brambles. The air smelled of herbs and smoke, of earth freshly turned. Margaret was old, her back bent, her hair the color of ash, her eyes clouded with the weight of years, but her voice when she spoke carried the firmness of truth, long harbored. "You are Caldwell," she said, before Jonathan even spoke his name. "I knew you would come. They always come, sooner or later. When the house calls, the blood answers." Jonathan Sett's throat tightened. "You knew Elias." Her gaze hardened, yet her hands, knotted with age, trembled slightly as she gestured him inside. The cottage was sparse, lined with shelves of jars and faded icons, some Christian, some far older. "Yes," she said at last. "I was a girl then, servant to his household. I saw what he did." She paused, her eyes distant, "and what he invited into that house." Jonathan leaned forward, the lantern between them casting long shadows. "Tell me." Margaret exhaled, a sound like a sigh drawn from a century. Elias Caldwell was not merely ambitious. He was hungry, hungrier than wealth, hungrier than flesh, and hunger like his will always find a mouth wide enough to answer. He made his pact in the earth itself, with something that had dwelled beneath long before any church steeple pierced the sky. A shadow older than Christianity, older than stone crosses and holy writ. It was bound to the soil, waiting. Elias gave it his blood, and in return it gave him fortune, influence, power that no man should wield. Jonathan felt the words strike deeper than any chill the manor had given him. A demon, then. Margaret shook her head. "Do not call it that. It is not of hell nor of heaven. It belongs to neither. It is hunger, made eternal, and hunger does not vanish. It only waits." Elias promised it a lineage, his bloodline, and so it was bound. Every Caldwell since has either fed it willingly or been devoured by it when they tried to flee. Jonathan Seth's hands curled into fists. "And what of me?" Her eyes softened then, for the first time. "Your uncle delayed it. He held it off as long as he could. But when he died, the tether shifted. It turned its gaze to you. It is awake now, awake and waiting." The lantern crackled, its flame bending sideways though no draught touched it. Jonathan shivered. There must be a way to end it. Margaret looked down at her hands, folding them together as though in prayer. "The pact cannot be broken, only delayed. To sever it would mean severing your blood itself, and blood does not surrender easily. You cannot escape it, Jonathan. You can only decide how much it takes of you before it feeds." Her words fell like stone into a well, echoing without end. Jonathan rose unsettled, his breath uneven. The cottage walls seemed to close around him, her shelves of relics leaning like witnesses. "Then I am already lost," he muttered. Margaret Sitt's voice followed him as he turned to leave. "Not lost, chosen. And chosen blood always has two paths, submission or rebellion. But rebellion has its cost." Outside, the sky had darkened, though no storm brewed. The moors stretched wide and empty, the manor rising in the distance like a wound on the land. Jonathan walked back with lead in his veins, her words resounding with every step. The house was no longer dormant. Its hunger was not patient shadow now. It stirred, restless, eager, with each creak of the floors, each shiver of the windows, each ripple of reflection. Jonathan felt its gaze deepen. The curse had awakened, and it had chosen him. The house was changing, or perhaps it had always been this way, and Jonathan was only now attuned to its pulse. At first it was a stain, small, faint, tucked in the corner, where plaster met floorboards. Jonathan thought it water, the residue of damp moors pressing into the bones of the manor. But when he touched it, his fingers came away slick and red. Blood. Soon the stains spread. The walls glistened with a thin sheen of crimson, seeping from cracks like sweat from skin. By candlelight, the liquid shimmered darkly, its smell sharp and metallic, curling into Jonathan's nostrils until it coated the back of his throat. The very air thickened, saturated with the iron tang of rot. He could not breathe without tasting it. At night the manor groaned, but it was no longer the settling of beams or the whisper of wind. It was voices, screams that reverberated from the stones themselves, 1,000 overlapping cries that rose and broke like waves against the silence. Jonathan would wake with his heart clawing at his ribs, convinced the house itself was shrieking around him. And then came the rattling. From beneath the floors, deep in the earth where the cellar burrowed, came a sound like bones shifting against one another. Not once, but again and again, building into a rhythm both hideous and steady. It was not the random collapse of brittle remains, but a chorus, skeletal jaws clicking in unison, spines realigning as though preparing to stand. Jonathan's hands shook whenever he lifted a candle. He no longer trusted the dark, yet the light revealed truths more terrible. Every hallway bore new stains, every corner whispered with shapes half glimpsed. He walked the manor like a man trespassing through his own grave. One night, driven by a force he could not name, Jonathan descended again into the cellar. The air grew colder with every step, his breath visible in the lantern's glow. He expected only the bones he had already seen, stacked like trophies, but when he pressed against the far wall, he felt a hollow space give way. There was another chamber. He forced the stone aside, scraping his hands raw until a narrow passage revealed itself. The air that bled from it was fetid, older than the house itself, carrying a scent that was neither holy decay nor holy earth. He raised the lantern and stepped through. The chamber was no storage, no cellar, it was a chapel. An altar rose at its center, carved from a single slab of black stone, its surface etched with symbols Jonathan did not recognize but had seen before, circling his dreams, scrawled in the margins of his uncle's journals, whispered in the flicker of Elias's painted eyes, spirals within spirals, jagged lines like ribs broken open, shapes that twisted the gaze and left his stomach hollow. They were not Christian, not even pagan. They were older, the script of something that had watched humanity long before humanity had prayed. The walls of the chapel pulsed faintly, wet with the same crimson that bled through the manor above. It dripped into grooves carved into the floor, flowing toward the altar, as though feeding it. And as Jonathan stood there, lantern trembling, he swore the stone exhaled, a slow, hot breath rising from below, carrying with it the weight of centuries. He staggered back, clutching at the journal he had brought for reference. His uncle's final entry burned in his memory, words scrawled in fevered hand. The house does not let you leave. It does not let you forget. It does not let you live. Jonathan's mind reeled. The ledger, the feasts, the portraits, the bones, all threads of the same tapestry, each act an offering to sustain what lay beneath. The manor itself was not simply cursed. It was constructed as a vessel, a conduit, an open mouth pressed against the soil where Elias had pledged his blood. Every stone laid, every room furnished, every portrait hung, all extensions of this hidden chapel, the heart of the curse. He placed a hand on the altar. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly, as though blood still coursed through it. For an instant he thought he felt it respond, a tremor, a shiver, as though acknowledging its air. Jonathan ripped his hand away, bile rising in his throat. He staggered to the stairs, but even there the realization pursued him. This house was no inheritance. It was a prison built to contain him, to shape him, to guide him toward one ending alone. He thought of Margaret's words, "The pact cannot be broken, only delayed." But how long could one man delay the appetite of eternity? Jonathan climbed back into the manor's upper halls, his steps uneven, his lantern's flame guttering. The portraits hissed, louder now, their voices clearer. The mirrors did not ripple. They opened, revealing Elias waiting in every reflection, smiling with the certainty of a man who had written history with his own blood. The manor moaned around him, and Jonathan knew the entity had stirred fully. The stones were awake, the walls bleeding, the bones rattling their chorus in the deep. He was no longer a visitor, no longer a master. He was prey walking through the open jaws of his family's legacy. And the jaws were closing. Sleep no longer belonged to Jonathan. It was a door Elias opened at will, beckoning him into chambers of nightmare dressed as inheritance. Yet now, even waking brought no reprieve. It began subtly, shadows cast longer than they should, stretching toward him though the lantern burned steady. In the corners of mirrors, Elias's face surfaced faint as smoke, his gaze cutting sharp as glass. Soon Jonathan could not walk the halls without glimpsing his ancestor, standing at the head of the staircase, seated in the gallery's high-backed chair, lingering at the periphery of candlelight like a memory that refused to dissolve. Elias did not rage, nor threaten, not at first. His voice was calm, persuasive, almost fatherly. "You resist, Jonathan," he said one night, as Jonathan sat hunched over the ledger in the library, the fire guttering low. Elias appeared across the room, framed in shadows, yet more solid than dream. "But resistance is the posture of children. Do you not see? You are chosen, not cursed. The weight you feel is not burden, it is privilege." Jonathan sits, fists tightened on the ledger. Privilege, to inherit slaughter, to walk corridors drenched in blood. Elias stepped closer, though his boots made no sound upon the floorboards. His eyes shone with that predatory gleam, alive with centuries of certainty. "You speak of blood as though it is shame. Blood is wealth, Jonathan. It built this house, these lands, the fortune your forebears squandered. It is the currency by which the world is truly moved, and it is yours to command, if you would only stop pretending to be less than you are." Jonathan's chest tightened. He thought of the city, of his failures, debts unpaid, opportunities lost. He had left behind ambition shattered, dreams mocked by ruin. Elias's words pierced those old wounds, drawing ache like poisoned needles. "You are weary, are you not?" Elias whispered, circling him. "So weary of struggle, of clawing for scraps when greatness waits already written in your name. You could reclaim it all. Wealth, influence, respect, even health. You carry your exhaustion like a shroud, but it need not remain. I can give you vigor. I can restore you." Jonathan closed his eyes as though blindness could mute the voice, but it only deepened, pouring into him like honeyed venom. "All you must do," Elias said, "is accept the truth, that resistance is futile, that your blood is not your prison, but your crown." Jonathan rose abruptly, his chair clattering back. "And the cost, the bones beneath this house, the children taken, the servants who wrote warnings in their own blood. Was that also a crown, Elias, or only carrion dressed as glory?" For the first time, Elias's smile widened, as though Jonathan's fury was precisely what he desired. His form shimmered slightly, edges blurred, yet his voice remained sharp. "Do not be naive. Every kingdom is built on graves. Every fortune, every empire, rests upon the bones of those who fed it. Your mistake is not horror, it is hypocrisy. You recoil from what you are, but you cannot change it. You are Caldwell. You are mine." Jonathan's breath came ragged, his hands trembling though his anger grew. "No," he hissed. "I am not yours. I am not your vessel." Elias tilted his head, studying him with the patience of a hunter watching prey exhaust itself. "You refuse. Bold, noble perhaps, but foolish." His smile lingered, unbroken, a crescent of triumph that time itself had not dimmed. "Then you will be destroyed." The words were not shouted. They were whispered, soft as the rustle of leaves, yet heavier than any curse Jonathan had ever heard. The air itself seemed to bow beneath them, the fire dimming, the walls sighing as though in assent. Jonathan staggered back, his heart thundering. The library pressed close around him, shelves groaning, portraits hissing their approval. Elias's form did not vanish. He remained watching, his smile eternal. But Jonathan saw something beneath that smile now, not benevolence, not even anger, but hunger. Endless, insatiable hunger. Jonathan's choice had been made. He would not submit, but defiance carried no safety, only consequence. The room grew colder. The house itself seemed to lean inward, the curse no longer merely awake, but quickening. Jonathan stood alone, his chest heaving, the echo of Elias's promise wrapping around him like a noose. He whispered to himself, though his voice shook, "Better destroyed than damned." Yet even as he spoke, he knew destruction was not merciful, not swift. The house would see to that. The pact would see to that. And Elias, smiling, eternal Elias, would wait at every shadow until the end. Night fell upon Blackwood with the heaviness of a shroud. Jonathan stood alone in the study, the ledger open before him, its blackened pages curling from the fire's heat. He had burned half of it already, but the ink still bled across the surviving sheets, as though the words themselves refused to die. Outside, the wind shrieked through the trees, rattling the window panes like bones in a charnel house. The air carried the scent of rain and earth, but beneath it was something darker, something foul, the smell of iron, wet stone and decay. It began quietly, a whisper sliding through the room. Not Elias's voice, not yet, but the sound of dozens, perhaps hundreds, layered into one. They rose from the walls, from the rafters, from the very stones of the foundation. Each syllable carried sorrow, rage, hunger. Then the house woke. The door to the study slammed with a violence that rattled the shelves. The chandelier above swayed and crashed into the floor, scattering shards like teeth. Jonathan staggered back as the flames in the hearth roared higher, stretching unnaturally, taking the shape of writhing limbs before collapsing into cinders. He clutched the silver candlestick he had carried since finding the cellar chapel, more a talisman than a weapon, though he doubted either mattered now. The manor shook, as though gripped by an earthquake. Portraits that had hung for centuries rattled and fell. When Jonathan looked, the painted faces no longer stared passively. They screamed, mouths open wide, eyes bulging, their voices a cacophony that filled the halls. The cries were not of warning, but of demand. Join us, fulfill your debt, complete the circle. Jonathan tore through the corridor, his boots crunching glass and splinters. Every door he passed slammed shut, windows shattered outward, letting in blasts of cold air and rain, yet no escape appeared. Every threshold folded back into another corridor, another stairwell. The house no longer followed mortal design. It bent upon itself, reshaping into a labyrinth of torment. The walls bled, crimson seeped between the stones, trickling like tears. The smell of rot thickened, choking, as if the house exhaled centuries of hidden corpses. Jonathan pressed forward, one hand covering his mouth, the other gripping the candlestick. Each step echoed not as his own, but doubled, as though another walked beside him, unseen. At last he stumbled into the grand hall. The long banquet table stretched before him, covered in platters of food that writhed and pulsed as though alive. Meat bled anew, bread molded and split, wine bubbled thick and black like tar. Around the table sat figures skeletal and spectral, the lineage of Caldwell, assembled in silence, their heads turned in unison as Jonathan entered. At the head sat Elias, immaculately dressed. Though his skin flickered between flesh and ash, he raised a goblet, smiling with the serenity of a priest. "Welcome, nephew," he intoned, his voice echoing from every corner of the room. "The family awaits your place." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "You shall have nothing from me." Elias's smile widened. He stood, arms spreading as though to embrace him. "Defiance is a luxury of the living. You are no longer merely Jonathan Caldwell, you are the Covenant Sep's heir, its vessel. Deny me, and you deny yourself." The air trembled, the walls shook. Jonathan's vision swam with shadows stretching like grasping fingers. Yet even as fear gnawed at him, rage burned hotter. He thought of Margaret's warnings, of the maid's suffering, of the bones stacked beneath the floorboards. This was not destiny. It was theft, a pact of blood binding innocent generations to a hunger that was not theirs. "No," he growled, "I will end this." He turned and fled, ignoring the echoing laughter of Elias and the chorus of the dead. The manor twisted again, but Jonathan knew where it was leading him. Every collapsing stairwell, every narrowing corridor, every burst of glass drove him downward toward the cellar, toward the chapel. The descent was agony. Shadows lashed like whips, slamming him against walls. Splinters tore at his clothes. Glass cut his hands. Whispers coiled into screams, filling his skull with commands. "Submit. sacrifice, seal the bond. But he forced himself forward, his feet carrying him step by step until the air grew colder, damper, until the floor beneath him was stone. The chapel awaited. The chamber glowed with a sickly light, the altar gleaming slick with something darker than oil. Symbols carved into its surface pulsed faintly, as though veins carried blood through the stone itself. And before the altar stood Elias, his figure clearer now, more solid, his shadow stretching monstrously against the wall. Behind him loomed the family, row upon row of spectral Caldwells, their faces a blend of sorrow and hunger, their bodies half rotted, half glowing with unnatural fire. "You see," Elias said softly, almost tenderly, "this is what we are. This is what we were made to be. Why fight eternity when it could be yours?" Jonathan staggered to the altar, his chest heaving, his eyes burned with exhaustion, his body broken by the night's assault. For a moment, he wavered. The thought of ending it all by surrendering, of finally resting, beckoned with a cruel allure. But then he laid his hand on the altar. The stone was cold, pulsing faintly beneath his palm. And in that touch, he understood this was no holy covenant. This was a parasite, feeding on his bloodline, chaining it to endless torment. It was not family, it was slavery. Jonathan pulled the oil flask from his coat, his uncle's own supply, once meant to light candles in this very chamber. He uncorked it and poured it across the altar, across the pews, across the ledger pages scattered on the floor. Elias's calm faltered, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" Jonathan struck flint to steel. Sparks caught, flames roared. "I will not be your vessel," he said. His voice was steady now, stronger than it had ever been. "If this house demands blood, it will burn with me." The fire surged. The oil-fed flames leapt across stone and wood, devouring pages, pews, and tapestries. The chapel wailed, not the spirits, not Elias, but the stone itself, shrieking as the curse convulsed. Shadows twisted into shapes, writhing and screaming as they were consumed. The spectral Caldwells howled, some clawing toward Jonathan, others crying in release as their forms dissolved into ash. Elias staggered, his body splitting, his smile finally breaking into a snarl. "Fool," he roared. "Do you think fire will unmake eternity? You burn only yourself." Jonathan gritted his teeth, lifting the candlestick like a weapon. "Then I burn free." The roof cracked. The walls shuddered. Stones fell like rain. The manor above began to collapse, centuries of corruption tearing itself apart. Jonathan forced his way up the cellar stairs, fire chasing him, smoke filling his lungs. Each step was war, each breath a blade, but he climbed. Behind him, Elias's scream rose, not of anger now, but of fear. The sound tore through the manor, through the night, through the very bones of Blackwood. It was the scream of something ancient being dragged into ruin. Jonathan burst into the entry hall as the ceiling caved, timbers crashing around him. He staggered toward the door, shoving it open with the last of his strength. Rain drenched him as he stumbled onto the moors. Behind him the house roared in flames, its silhouette writhing as though alive, every window vomiting fire. He collapsed to his knees, coughing, shaking, watching as Blackwood Manor screamed and fell. The portraits, the chapel, the bones, the ledger, all consumed. A legacy of blood, undone in ash and smoke. And yet as dawn began to break across the horizon, Jonathan could not tell if he had destroyed the curse or only set it free. The first light of morning broke pale over the moors, a thin grey veil spilling across the wet grass. Jonathan stumbled into it like a man reborn, though nothing in him felt new. His lungs still carried smoke, his ears still rang with the cries of the house. His body was battered, bloodied and trembling, but he was alive. Behind him Blackwood Manor burned. The flames devoured what centuries had built. Roofs caved, windows burst outward, Beams collapsed in showers of sparks. Black smoke twisted skyward in vast plumes, so dense it blotted out the rising sun. And within that smoke, there were shapes, fleeting, shifting, faces of the Caldwell dead, pulled screaming into the clouds. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds were silent, the moors stretching wide and hushed, as though bearing witness to an execution too long delayed. Jonathan stood with his hands on his knees, his chest heaving. Each breath carried ash. Each exhale trembled with exhaustion. He wanted to collapse into the wet grass and let it cradle him, but something held him upright, a current of dread that whispered he was not yet finished. The fire spread outward, licking across the foundations, racing through the bones buried beneath the house. He could hear them, the bones shifting, crackling, splitting, as if resisting their release. The ground groaned with the weight of centuries of secrets, and then fell silent. It should have felt like triumph, liberation, the undoing of a curse that had strangled his family for generations. Yet no joy came, no relief. Jonathan watched the manor crumble into ruin, and what he felt most keenly was emptiness. The house had defined him, haunted him, consumed his days and nights since the moment he first crossed its threshold. And now, as it died, it took a piece of him with it. He turned away, walking farther onto the moors, but his steps were heavy, unsteady, as though he carried the stones of the manor in his chest. He could not escape the thought that nagged at him, gnawed at him. The curse was not only in the mortar and beams, not only in the chapel beneath the soil. It was in him, in his blood. The villagers would see the smoke soon. Perhaps they would whisper that the house had finally claimed itself, or that God's justice had struck at last. Perhaps they would see him and make the sign of the cross, or flee from him altogether. He could not blame them. He was not sure if he had destroyed something monstrous or unleashed it upon the world. Jonathan paused at the crest of a hill, the manor now a silhouette of flame and ruin below. The smoke rose like a pillar, black against the grey dawn. He stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow, his body numb. Images swam before him. Elias smiling with calm malice, the ledger's damning words, the bones stacked in silent rows, the banquet of ghosts. Each memory was etched into him deeper than any scar. He thought of Margaret's warning. The pact cannot be broken, only delayed. Had he delayed it now? Or had he, in his rebellion, shattered the prison that kept it contained? What if the entity no longer had walls to anchor it? No stones to bind it? What if it drifted free, following him, wearing his blood as its new foundation? The questions coiled like smoke around his mind. For every step he took away from the manor, he felt the weight of those unseen eyes on his back. The curse had always been patient. It had waited through generations, biding its time. Why would it not wait again? Jonathan's body ached, but it was his spirit that trembled. He looked down at his hands, blackened with soot and streaked with blood. They shook, not from exhaustion, from uncertainty. Could these hands ever be clean again? Could his blood ever be anything but tainted? The wind shifted, carrying with it the last echoes of the house. Screams rose faintly in the smoke, some shrill with anger, others soft with release. He closed his eyes, listening, trying to discern which voices lingered. Were they freed souls rising to heaven, or damned spirits loosed upon the world? He could not tell. Perhaps both. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. The fire hissed and spat as drops struck the flames. The smoke thickened, spreading across the moors, until Jonathan could see little more than grey. The land blurred, the sky dimmed, and he stood in a world half-born, half-buried, caught between ruin and renewal. At last he turned his back on the manor. His legs carried him forward, though every step felt like walking through water. He did not know where the path would take him. To the village, to exile, to death, it hardly mattered. He was untethered now, cast adrift, carrying with him nothing but questions. As the smoke swallowed the horizon, Jonathan whispered to himself, the words barely audible against the rain. Can blood ever be cleansed, or does it always remember? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as he walked into the mist. Behind him, Blackwood Manor collapsed into ash. Ahead of him stretched only silence, and the endless weight of inheritance.